You can tell a lot about a man by the way he watches a room. I heard someone say once, though nobody in that SEAL gym had ever bothered to notice me watching anything at all. Most mornings I was just the quiet old janitor pushing a mop across the rubber flooring while the clang of iron plates echoed through the building like distant church bells. The place smelled like chalk dust, sweat, and the sharp tang of disinfectant that clung to my hands no matter how many times I washed them. Navy SEALs filled the room before sunrise, young men built like oak trees, lifting weights that would have snapped the backs of most civilians. I moved slowly between their racks and benches, keeping my head down, the wheels of my mop bucket squeaking softly across the polished concrete. Nobody paid attention to the old man cleaning the gym, and that was just fine by me. The truth is, invisibility can be a comfortable place to live after a long life. I was wiping down a bench press station near the far wall when the voice cut through the room. "Hey, old-timer, you ever actually lift one of these things?" The comment drew a few chuckles from the cluster of operators nearby. I didn't look up right away. I just kept working the rag across the vinyl pad, slow circles, the way I'd done every morning for the past 4 years. Eventually I raised my eyes and saw the man who'd spoken. He was young, maybe late 20s, shoulders wide enough to block half the mirror behind him. His name tape read Carter. Petty Officer Carter, if I remembered right. He had that confident grin that young warriors tend to wear when the world hasn't humbled them yet. "You know," he continued, resting one boot on the bench, "most guys your age are playing golf or watching TV. You're mopping floors in a SEAL gym. That's dedication." A couple of the others laughed quietly. Not cruel laughter exactly, more like casual amusement. I gave him a small nod, the kind that doesn't invite conversation, and returned to the bench with my rag. The rubber flooring beneath my boots absorbed the impact of heavy barbells hitting the ground across the room. Someone grunted through a deadlift set. Metal rattled. Fans hummed overhead, pushing cool air through the building. I'd always liked gyms. They had a rhythm to them, like a steady heartbeat. Carter stepped closer, curiosity apparently winning over boredom. "So what did you do before this job?" he asked. "You ever serve? Or you just been cleaning bases your whole life?" His tone wasn't angry. It was playful, the way younger men sometimes test the boundaries of a stranger. I shrugged one shoulder. "Just worked where I could," I said quietly. My voice sounded older than I felt most days, rough like gravel under tires. Carter smirked and turned toward the others. "Hear that? Mystery man." One of the operators chuckled and loaded another 45-pound plate onto a barbell. I bent down to wring out my rag in the bucket. As I did, the collar of my faded work shirt shifted slightly against my neck. A cool breeze from the overhead fan brushed the skin just below my hairline. I didn't think much about it. After all, I'd worn the same shirt 1,000 times. But when I straightened up, Carter's expression had changed. The grin had faded just a little. His eyes narrowed like he was trying to focus on something small and unexpected. "Hold on," he said slowly, leaning closer. "What's that on your neck?" I didn't answer right away. I just picked up the mop again and pushed it forward across the floor, the wet rubber shining briefly under the fluorescent lights. Carter stepped around in front of me now, curiosity pulling him like gravity. "Is that a tattoo?" he asked. The room hadn't gone silent, but the energy had shifted, like the moment before a storm when the wind changes direction. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck as the mop glided forward, leaving a clean path behind it. "It is just an old tattoo," Carter said, but his voice had changed in a way that told me curiosity had already taken hold of him. I kept the mop moving across the rubber floor, slow steady strokes that pushed a thin wave of water ahead of the gray fibers. Around us the gym carried on with its usual rhythm. Steel plates clanked against barbells, a bench creaked under the strain of a heavy press, and the ventilation fans hummed overhead, pushing cool air through the building. But Carter was no longer paying attention to any of that. His eyes stayed fixed on the back of my neck. I could feel it without turning around, the same way you can feel sunlight on your skin even with your eyes closed. "Hold still for a second," he said, stepping a little closer. I stopped the mop mostly because it would have been awkward to keep pushing it while he stood in my path. Carter leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a clearer view beneath the collar of my faded work shirt. The tattoo had faded with age, just like the rest of me. The ink was not bold anymore. Time had softened the edges until the lines looked almost like shadows pressed into the skin. To most people it would not mean anything at all. just a strange little mark hidden where most men would never notice it. Carter squinted as if he was trying to read a symbol he could not quite understand. That does not look like a biker tattoo, he said slowly. A few of the other operators had begun to drift closer, drawn by the simple gravity of curiosity. One of them wiped chalk from his hands and stepped nearer, tilting his head. What is it supposed to be? Another voice asked. I picked up the mop again and resumed pushing it toward the far wall. The water left a clean trail behind me that glistened under the bright fluorescent lights. Just something from a long time ago, I said quietly. Carter did not move aside right away. He studied the back of my neck for another moment before finally stepping out of the path of the mop. Looks like some kind of unit symbol, he said, half to himself. But I have never seen it before. That part did not surprise me. Very few people had. The truth is, some symbols are not meant to be recognized by everyone. They belong to moments in history that never make it into textbooks or documentaries. They exist quietly, carried only by the people who were there. Carter folded his arms across his chest, still studying me as if the answer might reveal itself if he stared long enough. You said you worked around bases before this, he continued. Where exactly? I wrung out the mop in the bucket again, the metal handle rattling softly as I pressed it down. Different places, I said. It was not exactly a lie. Over the years I had worked in more places than I could easily list. Carter exhaled through his nose, clearly not satisfied with the answer. You are pretty calm for a guy getting interrogated by a room full of SEALs, he said with a grin that had returned to his face. A few of the others chuckled again. I shrugged and pushed the mop toward the next section of floor. Calm had become second nature a long time ago. When you have lived long enough, you learn that most moments are not worth rushing. Carter shook his head as if the mystery amused him more than anything else. You know what I think, he said to the group behind him. I think our janitor here has a story he does not want to tell. I said nothing. The mop slid forward across the floor, the wheels of the bucket squeaking softly as I moved. But across the gym, near the row of squat racks, another man had stopped moving entirely. Chief Petty Officer Ruiz had been supervising a training set a few minutes earlier, watching one of the younger operators correct his form. Now he stood completely still, his eyes locked on the back of my neck. Unlike Carter, Ruiz was not smiling. His expression had gone very still, the way experienced men sometimes look when a small detail suddenly connects to a memory buried deep in their mind. For several seconds he did not speak. Then quietly, without drawing attention to himself, he stepped away from the rack and walked toward the hallway that led out of the gym. Chief Ruiz moved quietly, but I noticed him leaving the gym the same way a man notices a change in the wind. Years of habit had trained my eyes to catch small movements even when I appeared focused on something else. I kept pushing the mop across the floor, guiding the gray fibers along the rubber tiles while the bucket wheels squeaked softly behind me. Carter and the others were still standing nearby, though their attention had shifted between me and the strange little symbol they had glimpsed on my neck. The moment had already become a small mystery inside the gym. You see that look he gave you? Carter said to the others with a grin. Our janitor just spooked the chief. A few of the operators laughed again, but the laughter sounded lighter now, like the edge of the joke had dulled. I wrung the mop out slowly, the handle creaking under the pressure of my hands. Water dripped back into the bucket with a steady rhythm. Carter leaned against a squat rack, watching me the way someone studies a puzzle that refuses to make sense. I swear I have seen something like that symbol before, he said, though his tone suggested he was not completely certain. Maybe in one of the unit history rooms or something. Another operator shook his head. Not any symbol I recognize, he replied. Looks older. That word hung in the air for a second. Older. I had heard it used 1,000 different ways over the years. Sometimes it meant outdated. Sometimes it meant forgotten. But every once in a while it meant something else entirely. I pushed the mop toward the far corner of the gym where the morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows along the wall. The beams of light stretched across the floor like pale ribbons, catching the faint sheen of water as the mop passed over it. Outside, somewhere beyond the base buildings, I could hear the distant roar of a helicopter crossing the sky. Carter followed me a few steps, curiosity still driving him forward. So you were telling me that tattoo is just some random thing? He asked. Because it does not look random. I paused for a moment, resting both hands on the mop handle. The wood felt smooth from years of use. Most things in life only make sense to the people who were there, I said quietly. Carter tilted his head as if turning the sentence around in his mind. That sounds like something a man says when he has a story he is not sharing. I gave a small shrug and resumed mopping. Behind Carter, the other operators drifted back toward their stations, though their glances still wandered in my direction from time to time. Curiosity does not disappear quickly in a room full of men trained to notice details. Across the gym, the heavy metal door near the hallway opened again with a soft click. Carter did not notice it at first. His attention remained locked on me, but I saw the figure who stepped back into the room. Chief Ruiz had returned, though he did not walk straight toward us. Instead, he paused near the doorway, his eyes scanning the gym with the careful calm of someone measuring a situation before stepping into it. His face looked different now. The easy expression he had worn earlier during training had vanished. In its place was something quieter, more focused. Carter finally noticed him and gave a casual wave. "Chief, you missed it," he called across the room. "Our janitor here has a mystery tattoo." Ruiz did not laugh. He did not even respond right away. He simply walked forward at a measured pace, his boots barely making a sound against the rubber floor. As he approached, his eyes settled once again on the back of my neck. For several seconds he studied the faded ink without saying a word. The room around us continued moving, weights clanking and fans humming overhead, but the space immediately around Ruiz felt strangely still. Carter glanced between us, suddenly unsure whether the joke had gone somewhere he did not expect. Ruiz finally spoke, his voice calm but very deliberate. "Where did you say you worked before this job?" he asked. I leaned lightly on the mop handle and looked at him for the first time since he stepped closer. The answer came slowly, not because I did not know it, but because I had not spoken it aloud in a very long time. "Different places," I said. Ruiz held my gaze for another moment. Then his eyes drifted once more to the tattoo at the edge of my collar. Something in his expression shifted slightly, like a memory sliding into place. Without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I watched Ruiz's thumb hover over the screen of his phone for a second before he finally tapped something and raised it to his ear. The movement was small, almost casual, but it carried a weight that Carter and the others did not seem to notice right away. Carter was still studying me like a man trying to solve a riddle that had suddenly appeared in the middle of his morning workout. The gym around us kept moving as usual. Someone dropped a barbell onto the padded platform near the deadlift racks. The metal thud echoed briefly through the room before fading back into the steady rhythm of the place. Fans turned slowly above us, pushing cool air down from the high ceiling. Carter glanced at Ruiz, then back at me. "Chief, you are really calling someone about a tattoo?" he asked with a grin that tried to keep the moment light. Ruiz did not answer him. He turned slightly away, speaking quietly into the phone so the words did not carry across the room. I could not hear what he said, but I recognized the tone. It was the careful voice people use when they want to be absolutely certain about something before they say too much. Carter folded his arms and looked back at me again. "Well, now I am even more curious," he said. "You must have done something interesting at some point." I leaned on the mop handle and gave a small shrug. "Most lives look more interesting from the outside," I said. Carter chuckled softly at that. Behind him, a couple of the other operators had drifted closer again, drawn back by the quiet tension forming around the conversation. Nobody said it out loud, but the room could feel it. Something small had shifted in the air. Ruiz finished speaking into the phone after a moment and lowered it slowly. For a few seconds he did not move at all. His eyes stayed on the back of my neck, fixed on the faded ink that Carter had spotted earlier. When he finally stepped closer, the humor had completely vanished from his expression. Carter noticed the change immediately. "Okay, now you are making it weird, Chief," he said with a half laugh. Ruiz ignored the comment. Instead, he studied the tattoo again, his brow tightening slightly, as if he was measuring each line of the symbol against a memory that had not been touched in years. The ink itself was not complicated. Time had softened the design until it looked like a simple mark pressed into the skin just below the hairline. But symbols do not always need sharp lines to carry meaning. Sometimes recognition comes from shape alone. Ruiz exhaled slowly through his nose. "Where did you say you worked before this?" he asked again. I rinsed the mop head in the bucket and twisted it through the wringer, the metal handle rattling softly under my hands. "Different bases," I answered. "Different years." Carter leaned closer to Ruiz, lowering his voice like a conspirator in a quiet joke. "Chief, it is Justin. Old guy with a tattoo," he said. Ruiz did not laugh. He kept his eyes on the symbol for another long second before finally speaking again. "That is not just a tattoo," he said calmly. Carter blinked once, surprised by the seriousness in Ruiz's voice. Around us the gym continued its steady motion, but several of the operators had stopped their sets without realizing it. One man held a barbell halfway through a repetition before gently lowering it back onto the rack. Curiosity has a way of spreading through a room faster than any command. Carter looked back at me, then at Ruiz again. "What do you mean it is not just a tattoo?" he asked. Ruiz straightened slowly and glanced down at the phone still resting in his hand. For the first time since the conversation began, a trace of uncertainty crossed Carter's face. Ruiz finally answered in the same quiet tone he had used on the call. "Because there are only a few people alive who would recognize it," he said. Carter frowned. "Recognize what exactly?" Ruiz looked back at me, his gaze steady now. "That symbol belongs to a team that officially does not exist anymore." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came out. At that exact moment, the heavy doors at the far entrance of the gym opened with a slow metallic click, and several heads in the room turned instinctively toward the sound. The heavy doors at the far end of the gym swung open with a slow metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Conversations stopped one by one as heads turned toward the entrance. Even Carter shifted his attention away from me for the first time in several minutes. A tall figure stepped inside, the bright hallway light behind him outlining the shape of his shoulders before the gym lights revealed his face. Commander Ryan Mercer did not walk quickly, but there was something about the way he entered the room that made the air tighten. Men who had been mid-exercise quietly set their weights down. Others straightened instinctively. The rhythm of the gym softened until the clanking of metal faded into a low murmur. Carter looked surprised, glancing between Mercer and Chief Ruiz as if trying to understand how a casual conversation had somehow drawn the commander of the facility into the middle of it. Mercer's eyes swept across the room once, taking in the scattered operators, the benches, the racks, and finally the small group gathered near the mop bucket. His gaze landed on Ruiz first. "Chief," he said calmly. Ruiz stepped forward immediately, his posture firm but respectful. "Sir," he replied. Mercer's voice carried easily across the quiet gym. "You said there was something I needed to see." Carter's grin had disappeared now. He stood a little straighter, suddenly aware that the situation had drifted far beyond a joke about a janitor with a tattoo. Ruiz nodded once and gestured subtly in my direction. "Yes, sir," he said. "I believe so." Mercer turned his head slowly until his eyes settled on me. For a moment, he did not move at all. I was still standing where I had been the entire time, one hand resting on the handle of the mop, the bucket beside me. The scene must have looked strange from his perspective. A small group of operators standing in a loose circle around an old janitor with a cleaning cart. But Mercer was not looking at the mop or the bucket. His eyes focused on the back of my neck. Carter shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Sir, it is probably nothing," he said quickly. "Just a tattoo we have never seen before." Mercer did not answer him. Instead, he stepped closer with the slow, deliberate pace of a man confirming something he already suspected. The gym had grown quiet enough now that even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed louder. Mercer stopped about 3 feet away from me. I could see the reflection of the overhead lights in his eyes as he studied the faded ink at the edge of my collar. For several seconds he said nothing. Carter looked from Mercer to Ruiz, then back to me, clearly unsure whether he should say something else or remain silent. Ruiz did not move. He simply watched Mercer with the patience of someone who already understood the gravity of the moment. Mercer finally spoke, though his voice was quieter than before. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. I considered the question for a second, not because the answer was difficult, but because it had been a long time since anyone in authority had asked me something so simple. "About 4 years," I said. Mercer nodded once without taking his eyes off the tattoo. Carter shifted again, his curiosity still fighting against the growing seriousness of the moment. "Sir, do you recognize it?" he asked. Mercer did not respond right away. Instead, he looked at Ruiz briefly, as if confirming that the chief had seen the same thing he had. Ruiz gave a small nod. Mercer turned back toward me. The room had become completely still now. Even the operators near the far racks had stopped moving entirely. Mercer straightened slightly, his expression settling into something thoughtful and unexpectedly respectful. Then he asked a question that caused several of the younger operators to exchange confused glances. "May I see it more clearly?" he said quietly. For a moment nobody in the gym moved. Commander Mercer's request hung quietly in the air, simple words that somehow carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. Carter blinked as if he had misheard the question. Operators did not usually ask permission from janitors. Yet Mercer's tone had been calm, respectful, almost careful. I shifted my grip on the mop handle and considered him for a second. His eyes had not left the faded mark beneath my collar. They were not curious in the same way Carter's had been. Mercer's gaze looked different. It carried recognition, or at least the possibility of it. Slowly I reached up and pulled the collar of my old work shirt down just enough for the ink to show clearly under the bright gym lights. The tattoo had faded over the years, the lines softened by time and sun and the quiet erosion of decades. What had once been sharp black ink now looked more like a shadow pressed into the skin. But the shape was still there. A small circle no bigger than a silver dollar, intersected by a narrow line and a simple star at its center. The design meant nothing to most people, but it had once meant everything to 5 men who had stood together on a cold airstrip long before many of the operators in this room had even been born. Mercer leaned slightly closer, studying the mark with the kind of concentration that comes from long experience. Around us the gym had fallen almost completely silent. Someone at the far end of the room slowly re-racked a barbell, the metal touching the hooks with a soft click that echoed through the stillness. Carter looked between Mercer and the tattoo again, confusion spreading across his face. "Sir, it is just a symbol," he said cautiously. Mercer did not look at him. His eyes stayed on the faded ink for several long seconds before he finally straightened again. The expression on his face had shifted into something thoughtful, almost distant, like a man remembering a story he had once heard but never expected to see proven real. Chief Ruiz watched quietly beside him, his arms folded loosely across his chest. "Sir?" Carter asked again, unsure whether he should keep speaking or step back entirely. Mercer finally turned toward him. "Where did you say you noticed the tattoo?" he asked. Carter gestured awkwardly toward me. "When he bent down to mop the floor, sir. It showed under his collar." Mercer nodded slowly and looked back at me again. For a moment he did not say anything. Then he asked a question that made Ruiz's posture stiffen almost imperceptibly. "What year was it placed there?" Mercer said. I rested both hands on the mop handle and met his eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had asked that question directly. Most people who saw the mark never understood it well enough to ask. 1979, I answered quietly. Carter frowned immediately. "That would make him barely older than I am now," he muttered to the others. Mercer heard him, but did not react. His gaze remained steady, measuring something deeper than the number itself. "And it was placed by whom?" Mercer asked. The memory drifted through my mind with surprising clarity. The smell of cold air on a quiet runway. The low hum of an aircraft engine idling somewhere in the dark. 5 men standing under a floodlight, while someone produced a simple needle and a small bottle of ink. I exhaled slowly and answered the question in the same calm tone. "By the only team that walked away from that runway together," I said. Ruiz's eyes closed for a brief second, as if a piece of history he had only heard about had suddenly stepped into the present. Carter looked completely lost now. "Sir, what team?" he asked. Mercer's voice was quiet when he answered, but every man in the room heard it clearly. "One that officially stopped existing a long time ago." The words settled over the gym like a weight nobody expected to lift. "One that officially stopped existing a long time ago." Carter blinked again, his confusion now obvious, but the rest of the room had grown strangely quiet. Even the operators who had been across the floor had drifted closer without realizing it. Curiosity spreads fast in a place like this. Mercer stood still for a moment, studying me as if comparing the man in front of him to a story he had carried in his memory for years. Chief Ruiz remained beside him, silent but attentive, the way seasoned men often stand when they know they are witnessing something rare. Carter finally cleared his throat. "Sir, I do not understand," he said carefully. "What team are we talking about?" Mercer did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced once more at the faded tattoo on the back of my neck, then slowly looked around the room. Every operator present seemed to be watching now. The clang of weights had stopped completely. Mercer folded his hands behind his back, a posture that made the room feel more like a briefing than a gym. Most of you have heard pieces of the story, he said calmly, though you probably thought it was just another piece of old naval folklore. Carter looked at the others, searching for someone who might already understand what Mercer meant. Nobody spoke. Mercer continued in the same measured voice. In the late 1970s, there was a small experimental unit that operated outside the normal command structure. It did not have a public name. It did not appear in most records. Even today, the details are rarely discussed. Ruiz nodded slightly, confirming the weight of the words without interrupting. Carter frowned, trying to follow along. You mean like an early special operations team? He asked. Mercer glanced at him briefly. Something like that, he replied, though the people involved preferred not to be remembered as an experiment. The room remained silent. I rested my hands on the mop handle and listened the way a man listens when someone begins telling a story that belongs partly to him. Mercer looked back at me again. According to the files that still exist, he said slowly, that team deployed together once. After that mission, the unit was quietly dissolved, and the surviving members disappeared back into the system. Carter tilted his head, clearly trying to assemble the pieces. But what does that have to do with the tattoo? He asked. Mercer nodded toward the mark on my neck. Because the members of that team marked themselves after the mission, he said. Not with medals or patches. With something simpler. Ruiz finally spoke, his voice low. A symbol only they would recognize. Carter's eyes widened slightly. Wait, he said, looking from Mercer to me. Are you saying that mark means he was part of that team? Mercer did not rush his answer. He studied me for another long second, then spoke with quiet certainty. That is exactly what I am saying. The words settled across the room like a ripple through still water. Carter looked at me again, this time with a completely different expression. The casual amusement from earlier had vanished. In its place was something closer to disbelief. One of the younger operators near the squat rack spoke for the first time. Sir, if that is true, he said cautiously, then how is he working here as a janitor? Mercer's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. Sometimes the men who carried the quietest responsibilities choose the quietest lives afterward. Carter rubbed the back of his neck, still trying to process what he was hearing. Sir, he said slowly, are we absolutely certain? Mercer looked at me once more before answering. There is one way to know for sure, he said. Then he asked me a question that made Ruiz inhale sharply beside him. Do you remember the call sign used by the team on that runway in 1979? For a few seconds nobody in the gym moved or spoke. Commander Mercer's question seemed to settle over the room like a quiet test that everyone understood, but only one man could answer. I rested my hands on the mop handle and looked at him, and for the first time since the morning began, I felt the weight of all the eyes around us. The younger operators leaned slightly forward, curiosity pulling them closer without realizing it. Carter stood only a few feet away now, the earlier humor completely gone from his face. He was watching me the way a student watches a teacher about to reveal the answer to something important. Chief Ruiz remained silent beside Mercer, though I could see the tension in the way his shoulders had squared. He knew the significance of the question. So did Mercer. I took a slow breath and let the quiet stretch for another second. Memories do not always return loudly. Sometimes they arrive like distant echoes, small details drifting back through time. The smell of cold air on an empty runway. The faint glow of floodlights against the dark sky. 5 figures standing in a loose circle beside an aircraft that nobody outside a handful of people ever knew had landed there. Carter shifted his weight slightly, clearly struggling to hold his silence. Mercer did not move. His eyes remained steady on mine. Finally I spoke. Raven lead, I said calmly. The words were simple, but the effect they had on the room was immediate. Ruiz inhaled slowly through his nose, the sound almost lost in the quiet. Mercer's expression did not change much, but the faintest nod appeared, the kind a man gives when something he suspected has just been confirmed. Carter looked from Mercer to Ruiz and then back to me, completely lost now. Raven lead, he repeated softly. One of the operators near the racks whispered the words again under his breath as if testing how they sounded. Mercer finally broke the silence. That was the designation used by the team during their final deployment, he said quietly. Carter stared at me, the pieces finally beginning to assemble in his mind. So that means, he started, though the sentence faded before he finished it. Mercer turned toward him slightly. It means the man you thought was just the janitor spent part of his life doing work that very few people in this room will ever hear about, he said. The words carried no drama, only quiet certainty. Around us the gym remained completely still. The clatter of weights had not resumed. Even the operators near the far wall were watching now. Carter rubbed the back of his neck again, embarrassment creeping into his expression as he remembered the jokes he had made earlier. Sir, I did not realize, he said quietly. I shrugged lightly and looked down at the mop bucket beside me. Most people do not, I replied. Mercer studied me for another moment, then straightened slightly. How long did you serve with them, he asked. I considered the question the same way I had considered many things over the years. Long enough, I answered. Ruiz allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but recognition. Carter looked around the room again, noticing the way the other operators were now standing straighter than before. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Mercer glanced once more at the faded tattoo before speaking again, his voice calm and respectful. There are very few symbols left from that unit, he said. Most were never recorded. Carter nodded slowly, still absorbing the moment. Then Mercer surprised everyone by doing something none of the younger operators expected. He stepped back half a pace and brought himself to attention. I watched Commander Mercer come to attention, and for a moment the entire gym seemed to forget how to breathe. It was not a dramatic movement. It was simple and precise, the kind of posture every operator in that room had practiced 1,000 times since the day they first put on a uniform. But the meaning behind it carried through the air like a quiet signal. Carter stared at him, clearly unsure if what he was seeing was actually happening. Chief Ruiz noticed first what Mercer had done, and without hesitation he straightened as well, heels settling together against the rubber flooring with a soft sound that echoed through the silent gym. The two of them stood there facing me, shoulders squared, eyes steady. Nobody had ordered it. Nobody had announced it. Yet every operator in the room felt the shift. One by one the men who had been watching from the racks and benches slowly set their weights down and stood upright. Carter looked around as the realization reached him. The joking tone he had carried earlier that morning was gone completely now. His back straightened instinctively, the way training teaches you to respond when something important is happening. Within seconds the entire gym had fallen into the quiet stillness of attention. I stood there holding the mop handle, an old janitor in worn work shoes with a cleaning bucket beside me, facing a room full of highly trained operators who were now standing in silent respect. It was not something I had expected when the morning began. For a moment none of us spoke. The hum of the ceiling fans drifted through the room, and sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the floor between us like pale ribbons. Mercer was the first to break the silence. Sir, he said simply. The word landed softly but clearly. Carter's eyes widened just a little when he heard it. The others did not move, though several of them shifted their focus toward me with new understanding. I rested both hands on the mop handle and shook my head slightly. Commander, I said quietly, that is not necessary. Mercer did not relax his posture immediately. Instead, he held the position for another second before easing his stance and stepping forward. The rest of the room followed his lead, though the respect in the air did not disappear with the movement. Carter finally exhaled and looked at me again, this time with something closer to humility than curiosity. I owe you an apology, he said. Earlier, I thought you were just... His voice faded as he realized there was no good way to finish that sentence. I gave him a small nod. Just the janitor, I said for him. Carter looked embarrassed, but I offered a faint smile to ease the moment. There is nothing wrong with that job, I added. It keeps the place running. Ruiz allowed himself a quiet chuckle at that. Mercer studied me again, though the tension from earlier had softened into something thoughtful. You never mentioned any of this when you applied for the job, he said. I shrugged lightly. It was a long time ago, I replied, and the gym needed a janitor more than it needed another story about the past. Carter glanced around the room, realizing that the men beside him were still looking at me with a new level of respect. The operators who had been lifting earlier now stood calmly, their attention steady but not intrusive. Mercer finally nodded slowly. History does not always announce itself, he said. I picked up the mop again and dipped it back into the bucket, wringing the water through the metal press before pushing the gray fibers across the floor once more. The rubber tiles gleamed briefly under the lights as the mop passed over them. Most of the best work never does, I said. Carter stepped aside so I could finish cleaning the area near the rack. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm. A barbell clinked softly as someone resumed a set. The ceiling fans continued their steady hum. Mercer and Ruiz exchanged a quiet glance before walking back toward the entrance. And just like that, the moment passed, leaving only the faint mark of a story that most people would never fully understand.